thank you for coming to this talk, and thank you to the organisers for asking me to give it. I'm just going to talk a little bit about some emerging results from the Imagine project, which is looking at how people think about risk around volcanoes, initially in parts of Latin America. The kind of premise for the project really is looking at the gaps between hazard and vulnerability. Hazard obviously is analysed by physical scientists in geological surveys in a lot of detail, but those cultures of those institutions that do that then end up having to interact with a lot of very diverse cultures on the ground, a lot of different ways of thinking and different ways of viewing volcanoes. A lot of people don't see the volcano primarily as a risk. They see it as part of their community or part of the landscape that they live in, that they gain lots of things from. And so we want to look at those sort of issues of culture, of power balances between institutions, and particularly issues where there are marginalized groups that don't really trust anybody who has anything to do with this, with the government, and therefore have trouble trusting in science as well. So we want to engage with some of these kinds of issues that intersect with vulnerability really important ways, but also intersect with hazard. And in the first phase of the project, we're working in Latin America, particularly on the Chile-Argentine border. And the volcanoes in red are ones that we are looking at. The ones where fieldwork, to some extent at least, has taken place so far are in bold. We're taking a mixed methods approach. So we have some physical science hazard modelling that Liz Gallant has done for us. And the physical scientists in Senachiumin have also got their own hazard maps for many of the volcanoes in the region. And then we also are doing a range of different social methods. So this is an example of a walking interview that Julie did in Chaiten. And the resident takes us around the town and shows important sites, things that are important to them, places that are meaningful in some way. Julie takes a photo and the resident explains why that site is important. And this covers all kinds of things. It's not just sort of culture and beliefs and worldviews, it's also socio-economic problems and challenges, and the way the landscape has changed over time. And in this region, there's also impacts of climate change, as well as really massive impacts from the 2008 eruption of Chaiten. And then also cover some aspects of their current risk perception and the way that they are thinking about the volcano now. Another method that we're using is called story spheres, and story spheres they're essentially 360-degree photographs that you can use then in a VR headset, like a really cheap one, like Gboard or something like that. And alongside that, you preserve an oral history or a memory of somebody from that site. So you pick sites that are important to people and record their memories of things that have happened in that place. And we're working with the Museo del Sitio in Chaiten, with Senachiumin, with Karen Holmberg in New York as well, to try to produce some new exhibits for the museum in Chaiten and help them to memorialise what happened in the 2008 eruption, and also therefore to carry forward that memory for future generations to understand some of the risk and the experiences. This is just an example of the kind of research process in action. The value of having social and physical scientists in the field together is something that really has come out already, really. And in this example, Julie and Rory collaborated with Senachiumin geologists to identify interviewees in Los Turbios, which is to the northeast of Chaiten. And they had these hints of exciting stories. And so they suggested that Julie do an interview, and she did, and she got lots of really interesting things from the residents. And Senachiumin, meanwhile, were mapping a deposit. And then in the minibus on the way back, they had a long discussion about the different things that they'd found out, and came up with the idea of sort of preserving the outcrop, embedding it in epoxy, alongside some story spheres and some of the kinds of accounts that people had in the museum, to try to use some of those stories to enhance people's understanding of the local geology in the area. The other place that we did some fieldwork this time around is the Kutracora Geopark, which kind of straddles Lonquimay and Jaima and goes towards Solipuli volcano and incorporates both the community of Melipeuco and Malalcahuello. This is a really interesting area because these three volcanoes have quite diverse histories and therefore sort of hazards and threats and degrees of social memory and social awareness. And if you can get hold of Liz's AGU post, her modelling from Solipuli is in that, and it's really, really interesting. So we've got quite diverse volcanic histories. Both Lonquimay and Jaima have recent activity, or relatively recent activity, but Solipuli doesn't. And so that presents a lot of different issues in the towns. Both of them are quite high risk, but there has recently been a lot of effort put in by Senahum, particularly in Melipeuco. This is a photo of the fair that Senahum held while Julia Mori was there. Whereas Malalcahuello recently hasn't had so much work. And so while people in Melipeuco may be a bit complacent in some ways, people in Malalcahuello don't really know what hazards are likely. They're going on the basis of their memory of previous eruptions of Lonquimay and Jaima, and then things they see on TV. So people mention the eruption in La Palma as, oh, it might be like that, because they don't have the information that they need. So misinformation, or at least information that might not be correct, is fed into their brains through no fault of anybody at all. And this is one of the big challenges that we have, I think, in the information age, is having to reach so many more people with volcanological science, and doing that in a way that they can understand and in a way that is culturally appropriate as well. And both of these places have significant Mapuche populations, and there are a lot of quite sensitive political issues around that we're working to try to understand better in the project. So overall, we're trying to do stuff that's useful for people in country, for the citizens, and for the Geological Survey that we're working very closely with. And we're thinking about this through geographical imaginaries, the ways that different groups think about their relationship with their environment, broadly conceived. And then we are working towards a conceptual framework that will pin that down much more tightly so that people can actually work from it in the future. We're also looking at the interdisciplinary process and the ways that social and physical science can complement each other and work together more effectively, so that, as we've seen in the brief examples here, that the research process can start to change the way that we think, both scientists and communities. It activates their memories in the case of the residents, but it also makes people think a little bit differently. So thank you very much, and a huge thank you to the collaborators. I'm really enjoying working with all of you.